Drop the bag, hands where I can see them. The command was a low, guttural rasp that seemed to suck the air out of the room. Maribel Knox froze. The heavy scent of rain and expensive cologne clung to the man standing in the shadows of the darkened foyer. Her fingers, numb from the cold, trembled against the straps of her delivery bag. "I'm just here for the delivery, Unit 4B," Maribel stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor. She had lived in this neighborhood long enough to know that meeting the eyes of a man like Seo Jin-Ho was a death sentence. A leather-gloved hand clamped under her chin, forcing her head up with bruising strength. Seo Jin-Ho's face was a mask of calculated ice. He was the man the tabloids called a businessman and the streets called a monster. His eyes searched hers, looking for a flicker of deception. "Liar," he hissed. "My security has spotted you at my perimeter 3 times this week. Who sent you? Was it the park syndicate?" "Nobody sent me. I'm just working," Maribel cried out, but he didn't listen. He ripped the bag from her hand, sending the contents crashing onto the marble floor. But as the items scattered, a tattered, yellowed photograph slid out of Maribel's pocket. Jin-Ho froze. The color drained from his face as he stared at the image of a woman holding a newborn, a woman he had buried 20 years ago. His grip on Maribel's arm didn't break, but it changed. The predator was gone, replaced by a man seeing a ghost. "Where?" he whispered, his voice cracking for the first time in a decade. "Did you get this?" The heavy double doors of the study swung shut with a muted thud that sounded to Maribel like the closing of a tomb. The room was a cathedral of dark mahogany and cold glass, smelling of old paper and the sharp metallic tang of filtered air. Seo Jin-Ho did not let go of her arm. He marched her toward a high-backed leather chair that sat isolated in the center of the room, positioned beneath a single aggressive spotlight. "Sit," he commanded. The word wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a physical blow. Maribel stumbled into the seat, her delivery vest crinkling loudly in the oppressive quiet. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She watched as Jin-Ho moved to the massive desk, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the rain-slicked city. He didn't sit. He began to pace, his movements fluid and predatory, like a tiger measuring the dimensions of a new cage. "This office has heard the confessions of men far braver than you, Maribel Knox," he said, finally speaking her name. Hearing it roll off his tongue made her skin crawl. It sounded like a threat. He laid the tattered photograph on the desk, smoothing it out with a slow, deliberate stroke of his thumb. "You are a delivery girl from the East Side. You have no criminal record, you have no affiliations, and yet you are here, at the center of my world, carrying a ghost in your pocket." "I told you," Maribel whispered, her voice trembling as she clutched her knees to keep her hands from shaking. I was just doing my job. The photo belongs to my mother. It's the only thing I have left of her." Jin-Ho stopped pacing. He leaned over the desk, the harsh light catching the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the terrifying void in his eyes. "Do not lie to me. Not here. My men have watched you. You've circled this block 3 times in 48 hours. You've lingered at the service entrance. You've scanned the security cameras." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate silk. "The park syndicate is known for using invisible couriers. They find someone desperate, someone with nothing to lose, and they give them a script. They tell them to act lost, to act tired, to carry a sentimental token just in case they get caught." He reached out, his gloved finger tracing the edge of the photograph on the desk. "This photograph is a masterstroke of psychological warfare. It targets the only weakness I have left." Maribel looked at the screens, the maps, the red circles around her bike, the timestamps that turned her mundane struggle for survival into a blueprint for an assassination. She realized with a sickening jolt that he didn't see a girl. He saw a ghost designed to haunt him. "You're a professional," he concluded, his voice devoid of any heat. "And a professional knows that once the cover is blown, the asset is liquidated. Tell me who gave you the photo, Maribel. Give me a name and I might make it quick." Maribel shook her head frantically, tears blurring the high-definition images of her own movements. There is no name. There is no syndicate. It's just me. I'm just Maribel. The silence that followed Jin-Ho's threat was thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and the looming shadow of violence. Maribel felt the cold edge of the chair's armrest digging into her skin, a physical reminder that she was trapped in a world that didn't believe in coincidences. But as she looked at the screens, at the distorted, suspicious version of herself, the terror in her gut began to curdle into something sharper. It was a flicker of raw, exhausted indignation. "You think this is a game?" she whispered, her voice gaining a sudden, jagged edge. She looked up, finally meeting Jin-Ho's predatory gaze. "You think I'm some professional playing a part? Look at my hands." She thrust them forward into the spotlight. Her cuticles were raw from the cold, her knuckles scarred from a lifetime of manual labor, and a faint tremor shook her fingers that no amount of acting could fake. Jin-Ho didn't move, but his eyes tracked the movement, narrowing as he observed the reality of her physical state. "I didn't circle your shipyard because I was watching guards," she spat, a sob catching in her throat. "I was there because my bike's chain was slipping and I couldn't afford a mechanic. I sat in that alley eating those fries because it was the only meal I had in 24 hours. I'm not an asset. I'm a person who is drowning." She leaned forward, her face inches from the man who held her life in his hands. "My mother died 6 months ago. Do you know what she left me? Not a fortune, not a secret. She left me $20,000 in medical debt and a stack of final notice bills that keep me awake until the sun comes up. Every extra delivery, every shortcut through an alley, every minute I spend staring at a GPS is me trying to keep the lights on in a house that feels like a tomb." Jin-Ho's expression remained a mask of stone, but his jaw shifted, a subtle sign of the pressure building behind his teeth. Maribel didn't stop. The words were pouring out now, a dam breaking under the weight of months of silent suffering. "That photo wasn't a masterstroke. It was in my pocket because I was going to pawn the silver frame it used to be in today, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It's all I have left of a woman who worked herself into an early grave so I wouldn't have to end up like the people in your world." She gestured wildly at the opulent office. "You see spies everywhere because you've spent your whole life hurting people, but some of us are just trying to survive the people you've already hurt." She slumped back into the chair, the defiance drained out of her, replaced by a hollow, aching fatigue. She looked at the photograph of the woman and the baby, lying so vulnerably on the mahogany desk. "Kill me if you want. It would be the first time in a year I didn't have to worry about tomorrow's rent." Jin-Ho stared at her. His gaze finally dropped from her eyes to the raw red skin of her knuckles. For the first time, the alkulated ice in his eyes seemed to flicker with something else. Not quite pity, but a recognition of a different kind of war. The air in the office grew thin, stifled by the sound of the air filtration system sounding like a low, mechanical growl. Jin-Ho did not speak. His eyes remained fixed on Maribel, searching for the crack in her story, the telltale flicker of a trained operative. But all he found was the ragged, soul-deep exhaustion of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Slowly, almost tentatively, Jin-Ho reached out and picked up the photograph. He held it by the edges, his gloved fingers contrasting sharply with the brittle, yellowed paper. He moved it under the direct beam of the desk lamp, the harsh light cutting through the grain of the film. It was a candid shot, taken in a garden that had long since been paved over. In the frame, a young woman with a radiant, gap-toothed smile sat on a stone bench, cradling a baby wrapped in a distinctive, hand-knitted blue blanket. The woman's eyes were filled with a fierce, protective joy, a look Jin-Ho spent 20 years trying to scrub from his memory. He felt a sudden, violent jolt in his chest, as if his heart had forgotten its rhythm. His breath hitched, the sound sharp and jagged in the silence. He turned the photo over. On the back, written in a faded, elegant script that he recognized instantly, were 3 words, "Our little light." The tablet slipped from his other hand, clattering onto the mahogany desk with a sound like a gunshot. Jin-Ho didn't notice. His gaze was locked on a tiny, almost imperceptible detail in the corner of the photo, a small, star-shaped birthmark on the inner wrist of the baby. He looked up at Maribel, his eyes wide and fractured with a sudden, overwhelming terror. The ice had not just melted, it had shattered. "Your mother," he whispered, his voice a ghost of its former authority. "You said she died 6 months ago." "Yes," Maribel said, her voice trembling as she watched the transformation in the man before her. "Yelena Knox. She was everything." Jin-Ho's hand shook so violently that the photograph fluttered like a dying bird. Yelena. That wasn't the name of the woman in the photo. The woman in the photo was Hana, his wife. But Yelena had been Hana's closest friend, the woman he had trusted to whisk his family away when the fire had consumed his first estate 20 years ago. He had been told they were all dead. He had been given 3 charred remains to bury. He had built a kingdom of blood on the foundation of that grief. He stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. He bypassed the desk, moving toward Maribel with a frantic, desperate energy. He didn't grab her chin this time. He reached for her right arm, his touch almost reverent as he pushed back the sleeve of her delivery vest and the thin fabric of her shirt. There, on the pale skin of her inner wrist, was a small, star-shaped birthmark. Jin-Ho let out a choked, broken sob, a sob that had been trapped in his throat for 2 decades. The ghost of soul collapsed to his knees on the cold marble floor at the feet of the girl he had just threatened to kill. The clutched the photograph to his chest, his forehead resting against the edge of Maribel's chair. The truth didn't just break the silence, it broke the man. The air in the office grew thin, stifled by the sound of the air filtration system. Maribel sat frozen, her pulse hammering against the very spot where his thumb had just traced the star-shaped mark on her wrist. She looked down at the man who had been a titan of terror moments ago, now reduced to a trembling figure on his knees. "The woman who raised you?" Jin-Ho choked, his voice stripped of its predatory edge. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and pleading with every ask. Tell me everything she ever said about where you came from. Tell me about the fire." Maribel pulled her arm back instinctively, tucking it against her chest. "How do you know about the fire?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "My mother, Yelena, she never talked about it, not until the very end, when the morphine made her slip. She used to scream in her sleep about the smell of smoke and the sound of breaking glass. She told me she found me in the ruins of a house that didn't exist anymore. She said she took me because there was no one else left to hold me." Jin-Ho flinched as if struck. He closed his eyes, the image of his burning estate 20 years ago searing through his mind. He had been told that the rival clans made sure no one escaped. He had seen the blackened beams, the ash that used to be his life. He had believed the lies of his own captains who claimed they had arrived too late. "She didn't find you," Jin-Ho whispered, the realization carving hollows into his face. "She was the one who was supposed to save you. Hana, my wife, she trusted Yelena more than she trusted me. When the sirens started, I thought Yelena had failed. I thought you were both ash." He reached out a trembling hand toward the photograph on the desk, his fingers hovering over the image of the woman with the gap-toothed smile. "The woman in that photo is not Yelena Knox. Her name was Hana. She was my wife. And that baby?" His voice broke, a jagged sob escaping his throat. "That baby was my Mi-cha." "No," Maribel shook her head, a cold, numb sensation spreading from her heart to her limbs. "My name is Maribel. Yelena was my mother. She worked 3 jobs to keep me fed. She died with my name on her lips." She hid you, Jin-Ho cried out, his voice a mixture of agony and awe. She renamed you to keep you away from the blood on my hands. She knew that as long as I lived, you were a target. She stole you to save you from me. He looked at the monitors, the surveillance footage of Maribel delivery driving through the rain, struggling to survive on pennies, while he sat atop a mountain of gold built on the memory of her death. The irony was a physical weight, crushing the breath from his lungs. He had spent 20 years hunting the people who killed her, never realizing his own shadow was the thing she was being protected from. The truth didn't just break the interrogation, it dismantled the very foundation of his life. The silence in the office was no longer the sharp, predatory quiet of an interrogation. It was the hollow, echoing stillness of a tomb. Seo Jin-Ho remained on the floor, his expensive suit rumpling against the marble, his forehead pressed against the edge of the chair where Maribel sat. The ghost of soul, a man who had commanded life and death with a flick of his wrist, looked small, broken. He looked at the monitors again, but the images of Maribel's deliveries now felt like 1,000 lashes against his back. He had spent 2 decades fueling a war of vengeance, convinced that rival syndicates had snatched his future from him. He had burned down neighborhoods and executed enemies in the name of a wife and daughter he thought were dead. But the truth was far more agonizing. Elena hadn't been a kidnapper, she had been a savior. She had seen the monster Jin-Ho was becoming, the violence that followed him like a plague, and she had chosen to give the child a life of poverty and peace rather than a life of luxury and blood. "I built all of this for you," he whispered, his voice thick with a self-loathing that seemed to age him 10 years in a single breath. He gestured vaguely at the dark, opulent room, the gold leaf on the ceiling, and the high-tech security grids. "Every kill, every territory I took, I told myself it was for the family I lost. But you weren't lost. You were hiding from me." Maribel watched him, her fear slowly being eclipsed by a strange, cold pity. "She never spoke your name," she said softly. "She told me my father was a man who got lost in the dark. She said he wasn't a bad man, just a dangerous one. I think she loved you enough to leave you." The words hit Jin-Ho harder than any bullet ever could. The realization that his own lifestyle had been the true villain of his story was a weight that buckled his spirit. He had been chasing shadows for 20 years, looking for an enemy to blame, only to find the culprit in his own reflection. He had allowed his daughter to grow up cold, hungry and exhausted, terrified of men exactly like him, while he sat on a throne of the very filth she was trying to escape. "I am the dark she was talking about," Jin-Ho murmured, finally lifting his head. His eyes were hollow, the fire of his paranoia completely extinguished. He realized then that his enemies hadn't destroyed his world. His own ambition had turned it into a wasteland. He had won the war for the city, but in doing so, he had lost the right to the only thing that actually mattered. He reached out, not to grab her, but to slide the photograph toward her with a trembling hand. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a ragged plea. "You should never have seen this face. She was right to take you." The heavy silence was shattered by a sharp, rhythmic chirping from the desk console, a high-frequency alert that Jin-Ho had tuned his ears to for a lifetime. He snapped out of his grief with the instinctive speed of a soldier. His eyes, still rimmed with red, flew to the bank of security monitors. The grainy footage of the perimeter was no longer empty. On the infrared feed, 4 heat signatures were moving with tactical precision through the rain-drenched gardens. They weren't delivery drivers or lost couriers. They were clad in matte black gear, carrying suppressed submachine guns, moving in a staggered formation that bypassed the primary sensors. "The Park Syndicate," Jin-Ho hissed, his voice instantly regaining its lethal edge. He swiped across the screen, bringing up the external gate camera. He saw it then, the mistake his enemies had made. They had watched Maribel enter. They had seen the ghost hesitate, seen his security detail stand down to let a lone delivery girl into the sanctum. To them, she wasn't an innocent. She was the perfect distraction, the breach in his armor they had been waiting for. "They think you're mine," Jin-Ho whispered, more to himself than to her.
He looked at Maribel, who was staring at the screens in mounting horror. "Who are they?" Maribel's voice was a frantic breath. "The real monsters," Jin-Ho replied. He reached under the mahogany desk, his hand coming back with a sleek black handgun. The metallic clack of him chambering around echoed like a death knell in the room. On the monitors, the first hitman reached the service entrance, the same one Maribel used. They were moving in a pincer maneuver, cutting off the exits. They didn't know the girl inside was the boss's daughter. They thought she was a pawn in a game of chess. To them, she was a target to be neutralized along with everyone else in the building. Jin-Ho stood, his tall frame casting a shadow that finally felt like a shield rather than a threat. He looked at the woman who had lived her life in the light, now trapped in his world of shadows. The paranoia that had consumed him for 20 years was gone, replaced by a singular, burning clarity. He had failed to protect her mother. He had failed to be there for her childhood, but he would not fail her now.
"Get behind the desk," he commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl of authority. "Stay low. Do not move until I tell you." As the first window downstairs shattered with a muffled explosion of glass, Jin-Ho didn't look at the doors. He looked at Maribel one last time, a silent promise in his eyes that the dark she had been running from was about to become the only thing keeping her alive. The office door hissed open as Jin-Ho grabbed Maribel by the shoulder, his grip firm but no longer bruising. He led her toward a paneled section of the mahogany wall that looked indistinguishable from the rest of the library. With a quick biometric scan of his palm, the wood receded, revealing a cramped, steel-lined chamber flickering with the blue light of secondary security monitors. "In now," he ordered. Maribel hesitated, her eyes wide as she looked at the arsenal of weapons lining the safe room's walls. "If the door closes and I don't come back to open it, there is a phone in there with one preset number. Press it. My lawyer will ensure you are disappeared safely, with enough money to never look back." "What about you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jin-Ho looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the coldness of the ghost of soul softened into the face of the man who had loved Hana 20 years ago. "I am finally doing what I should have done at the start," he said. He pushed her gently inside, and the steel door slid shut, sealing her in a heavy, pressurized silence. The moment the seal clicked, Jin-Ho's face transformed. The grief, the regret, and the shock were locked away behind a mask of iron. He discarded his suit jacket, rolling up his sleeves to reveal forearms corded with muscle and old, jagged scars. He didn't wait for the hit squad to find the office. He moved into the hallway, a shadow merging with shadows. The first hitman rounded the corner near the grand staircase, his weapon raised. Jin-Ho didn't use his gun. He didn't want the noise to alert the others to his exact position. He moved like a sudden blur of violence, closing the distance before the man could squeeze the trigger. He caught the hitman's wrist, the bones snapping with a sickening pop, and drove a palm into the man's throat. As the intruder collapsed, Jin-Ho caught the suppressed submachine gun before it hit the floor. He moved through the estate with a terrifying, rhythmic efficiency. This was the ghost his enemies feared, a man who didn't just fight, but erased. In the foyer, the pincer maneuver met a wall of lead and fury. Jin-Ho fired with surgical precision, utilizing the corners and marble pillars he had memorized over years of paranoid wandering. He was fighting for more than territory now. He was fighting for the little light Elena had managed to keep burning in the dark. Every time a bullet grazed his shoulder or a fragment of stone stung his cheek, he thought of the star-shaped birthmark on Maribel's wrist. He fought with a ferocity that bordered on the supernatural, a man possessed by the need for a final, bloody redemption. By the time the last of the 4 signatures on the monitor went dark, the pristine marble of the foyer was painted in the high cost of his past life. He stood alone in the settling dust, his chest heaving, a king of a castle built on graves, finally ready to face the daughter he had almost destroyed. The silence that followed the violence was heavier than the gunfire had been.
When the biometric seal on the safe room finally hissed open, Maribel stepped out into an office that felt fundamentally altered. Seo Jin-Ho stood by the window, his back to her. His white shirt was stained with the grit of the struggle, and a thin trail of blood traced a path down his hand, but his posture was no longer that of a predator. He looked like a man who had finally put down a crushing weight. He didn't turn around immediately. He couldn't. He wasn't ready for her to see the raw, paternal ache in his eyes, a truth he knew he had to keep buried for her own safety. If the world knew she was his blood, the hitmen would never stop coming. To protect her, he had to remain a stranger, a benefactor, a shadow. "It's over," he said, his voice raspy and hollow. He gestured toward the desk, where the photograph lay untouched amidst the chaos. "His men are clearing the perimeter. You are safe. You will be escorted home in a private vehicle." Maribel walked toward the desk, her fingers trembling as she reclaimed the photo. She looked at him, this terrifying, broken man who had gone from her executioner to her shield in the span of an hour. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why do all this for a delivery girl?" Jin-Ho finally turned, his face a mask of weary composure. "Because the woman who raised you was the only person in this world who knew the value of a life. I am merely paying a debt that is 20 years overdue." He reached for a thick, cream-colored envelope on the desk and pushed it toward her. "Inside is the deed to your mother's house, fully cleared. Your medical debts have been settled in full. There is also a trust, enough to ensure you never have to deliver another package, never have to work a night shift, and never have to look over your shoulder again." Maribel gasped, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at the documents. "I can't take this. I don't even know you." "You don't need to," Jin-Ho said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It was a sad, distant expression. "Think of it as a gift from someone who knew your mother's heart, someone who wants to see that little light she saved stay bright." He watched her as his security detail arrived to lead her away. He stayed by the window until the taillights of the car disappeared into the rain. He was the ghost of Seoul, the king of a blood-soaked empire, but for the first time in 2 decades, he felt a flicker of peace. He hadn't told her the truth, that she was his daughter, his Mi-cha, but as he looked out over the city he ruled, he knew he would spend every day for the rest of his life watching over her from the shadows. She would never know his name, but she would always be under the ghost's wing.